My parents came to Whitmore expecting to watch my twin sister cross the stage. They had flowers for her, a camera ready for her, and seats close enough to see every smile. They did not know I was graduating too. They definitely did not know I was the one scheduled to give the commencement speech. I know that sounds like the kind of thing a person plans for revenge, but I didn't start out that way. I started out as the other daughter. That was the easiest way to explain it. Victoria was the daughter people asked about at parties, the one my mother bragged about in grocery store aisles, the one my father called naturally gifted, even when she had tutors for classes I passed on my own. I was Frances, the twin who was independent, which sounded nice until you understood what they meant. Independent meant they didn't have to worry about me. Independent meant they could forget what I needed and still feel like decent parents. Independent meant I was expected to be grateful for whatever was left after Victoria was taken care of first. The college letters came on the same Tuesday in April, 2 thick envelopes sitting on the kitchen island like they belonged to the same kind of future. Victoria got into Whitmore University, the expensive private school she had talked about since sophomore year, the one with the brick walkways and alumni connections my father loved mentioning. I got into Eastbrook State, which was still a good school, just not the kind of school my parents could brag about over dinner. I remember holding my acceptance letter and feeling careful with my own happiness, like I already knew not to make too much noise with it. That evening, Dad called us into the living room to talk numbers, and he sat in his leather chair with his reading glasses low on his nose, acting like this was a business meeting instead of our lives. He started with Victoria. He said he and Mom had decided they would cover everything for Whitmore. Tuition, housing, meal plan, books, all of it. Victoria made this little gasp and covered her mouth, even though I'm pretty sure she already knew. Mom reached over and squeezed her hand, and Dad smiled like he had just made a smart purchase. Then he turned to me, and his face changed. Not angry, not even uncomfortable, just practical. Frances, we're not going to be able to fund Eastbrook for you. I stared at him because I thought there had to be another sentence coming after that. Maybe they could help with part of it. Maybe I'd need loans, but not all loans. Maybe this was one of those parent speeches about responsibility, where they scare you first and then offer a smaller kind of help. But there was no softer version coming. Dad leaned back and said Victoria had leadership potential. He said Whitmore would put her around the right people. He said she knew how to connect, how to make an impression, how to turn an opportunity into something bigger. Then he looked at the paper in my hands and said, "You're smart, Frances, but you're not special. There's no return on investment with you." I remember the room going very still after that. Not silent exactly, because the air conditioner was humming and Victoria's phone buzzed against the coffee table, but still in that way where your body understands something before your brain catches up. I looked at Mom, and she looked down at her lap like the stitching on her skirt had suddenly become very important. I wish I could say I stood up for myself right there. I wish I had thrown the acceptance letter on the table and told him he was wrong. I didn't. I just sat there holding that paper, feeling my fingers bend the corner of it, trying not to make my face do anything embarrassing. Victoria picked up her phone and started typing, probably telling her friends she was officially going to Whitmore. Dad kept talking about being realistic, about how I was resourceful, about how I would manage. That was one of his favorite words for me, manage. Victoria got support. I got told to manage. By the time the meeting ended, nobody had raised their voice. That almost made it worse, because they acted like they had not just split our futures in half and handed the better half to my sister. The thing is, it was not the first time. It was just the first time they put a number on it. When we turned 16, Victoria got a used but perfect Honda Civic with a red bow on the hood. I got her old laptop with a cracked screen and a charger that had to be angled just right or it died. When prom came around, Victoria had appointments at 2 boutiques, and I borrowed a dress from a cousin who was 4 inches taller than me. On vacations, Victoria got the bed near the window, the nicer suitcase, the first choice of everything. I got told I was easygoing, which meant I was expected not to complain. In family photos, Victoria stood between our parents. I was usually on the side, shoulder half cropped, smiling like I belonged there because I still wanted to believe I did. A few weeks before that living room meeting, I found my mother's phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. I know I shouldn't have looked. I'm not proud of it. But Aunt Linda's name was on the screen, and my own name was right below it, so I read before I could talk myself out of it. Mom had written, "I feel bad for Frances, but Harold's right. She just doesn't stand out. We have to be practical." I put the phone down exactly where I found it and walked upstairs without making a sound. At the time, I told myself maybe I was overreacting. Maybe parents said things in private that sounded worse than they meant. After the college meeting, I stopped giving that excuse so much room. That night, I opened the cracked laptop they had given me and typed 3 words into the search bar: full ride scholarships. I spent most of that summer on my bedroom floor with a notebook, a calculator, and the cracked laptop balanced on a stack of old magazines because the hinge barely held up anymore. Eastbrook cost $25,000 a year. 4 years meant $100,000, and that was before books, rent, food, laundry, bus fare, and all the little things parents forget are not little when you are paying for them alone. I had $2,300 saved from summer jobs and birthday money I had never spent because some part of me always knew I might need it. I remember writing the number down and staring at it, like if I looked long enough, it would become bigger. At first, every option felt like a trap. I could not go, which would let Dad be right before I even had a chance. I could take out loans that would follow me for half my adult life. I could work full-time and go part-time, which sounded responsible, until I realized it might take me 7 or 8 years to finish. I kept hearing Dad's voice in my head. Not even loud, just calm and certain. No return on investment. That was the worst part. Not that he said it, but that part of me was scared he might be right. I hated that part of myself, but it was there. So I made lists, because lists were easier than feelings. I listed every scholarship I could find, even the ones that seemed ridiculous. I listed campus jobs, off-campus jobs, housing options, textbook rental programs, emergency grants, meal plans, everything. The Eastbrook Merit Scholarship looked possible until I saw they only picked 5 students a year. The Whitfield Scholarship looked impossible because they picked 20 students nationwide, and I laughed when I saw it. I actually laughed out loud in my room at 2 a.m, this dry little sound that made me feel stupid. Still, I bookmarked it. I didn't believe I could get it, but I also didn't have the luxury of ignoring impossible things. My parents acted strange during those last weeks before I left. Not guilty exactly, more like they had already filed my problem away and were waiting for me to stop making the air uncomfortable. Mom bought Victoria a set of monogram towels for her dorm and asked me if I wanted the old blue towels from the upstairs linen closet. Dad took Victoria to lunch to talk about college strategy, and when I walked past the dining room afterward, I heard him telling her which alumni events to attend. Nobody asked me about Eastbrook, except to ask if I had figured everything out. That phrase started to make my skin itch. It sounded like concern, but it really meant, please don't make this our problem. Move-in day proved it. Victoria's things took up half the garage. Matching storage bins, new bedding, a mini fridge, lamps, clothes still in store bags. Mom kept walking around with a checklist, fussing over throw pillows and mattress toppers. My stuff fit into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box from the grocery store. I had a thrift store comforter, 3 pairs of jeans, the cracked laptop, and a coffee maker I bought for $6 because I knew caffeine was about to become part of my blood. When I carried my box out to the bus stop, Dad said, "You sure you don't want us to drive you?" in that tone people use when they know you will say no. I said I was sure. He looked relieved before he remembered to look sad. Eastbrook was not glamorous, but the first time I stepped onto campus, I felt something I had not felt at home in years. Space. Nobody knew I was the lesser twin. Nobody knew Victoria existed unless I told them. Nobody looked at me like they had already decided my size before I entered the room. My room was not even a real apartment, just a narrow bedroom in a house with 4 other students and a kitchen that always smelled like burnt toast. But it had a door that locked and a desk by the window. I paid $300 a month for it, utilities included, and I remember sitting on the bed the first night with my suitcase still zipped, thinking, this is ugly, this is tiny, and it is mine. The schedule nearly broke me by October. I worked at the morning grind from 5 a.m. to 8 a.m., went to classes, studied between lectures, cleaned residence halls on weekends, and applied for every scholarship that did not require a miracle. Some nights I fell asleep sitting up with a textbook open on my lap. Some mornings I drank coffee so strong it made my hands shake during class. I told myself it was the price of freedom, but honestly, some days it just felt like punishment for being born as the daughter they trusted to survive neglect politely. I did not say that out loud to anyone. I just kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. Thanksgiving freshman year was when something in me finally changed shape. I called home from my rented room with a cup of instant noodles on my desk and a blanket around my shoulders because the house heater barely worked. Mom answered, and I could hear laughter behind her, dishes clinking, Victoria talking over someone. I asked if Dad was there, and there was a pause, then his voice in the background, clear enough for me to hear. "Tell her I'm busy." Mom came back too bright, saying he was in the middle of something, and I said it was fine because that was what I had been trained to say. Then I opened Facebook after we hung up and saw Victoria's post. A photo of Mom, Dad, and her at the dining table, with candles and turkey and 3 place settings. The caption said, "Thankful for my amazing family." I zoomed in on that picture like an idiot, looking for proof that maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was a 4th plate just out of frame. Maybe my chair was pushed back somewhere. Maybe there was some sign that I had been remembered, even if I was not there. There wasn't. 3 plates, 3 chairs, 3 smiles. I sat there for a long time with my noodles getting cold, and I did not cry right away. I just felt embarrassed, which surprised me. Embarrassed that I had called. Embarrassed that I had asked for Dad. Embarrassed that some part of me was still waiting for a place at a table they had stopped setting for me years ago. The next semester, I took Microeconomics 101 because it fit my schedule, not because I expected anything from it. Dr. Margaret Smith had a reputation that made half the class nervous before she even walked in. People said she never smiled, never accepted late work, and could tell when you were pretending to understand something. She was in her 60s, silver hair pulled back tight, glasses low on her nose, and the kind of voice that made everyone stop whispering without her having to ask twice. I sat in the 3rd row because the front row felt too confident and the back row felt too easy to disappear in. The first essay nearly killed me. I wrote most of it after closing shift, half asleep, with coffee cooling beside me and my roommate arguing with her boyfriend through the wall. I turned it in thinking I had done enough to survive, maybe a B if she was generous. When she handed the papers back, mine had an A+ written at the top in red ink, so dark it almost looked angry. Under it, she had written, "See me after class." My stomach dropped. I thought maybe she thought I cheated. That was how used I was to good things having a catch. After class, I stood by her desk while everyone else filed out, and she looked at me for a second too long. "Frances Townsend," she said, tapping my paper with one finger. "Where did you learn to think like this?" I didn't know how to answer that, so I said, "I don't know, public school mostly." She didn't smile, but something in her face shifted. She asked about my background, my major, my plans, and I gave her the clean version at first, because the clean version was easier. Then she asked how I was paying for school, and for some reason I told the truth. I told her my parents were paying for my twin sister's private university and nothing for me. I told her about the jobs. I told her about the living room. I did not mean to say the investment line, but it came out anyway. Dr. Smith did not gasp or call my father horrible or give me one of those soft pity faces that make you wish you had stayed quiet. She just sat very still, listening like every word mattered. When I finished, she took off her glasses and said, "Have you applied for the Whitfield scholarship?" I almost laughed because I thought she was making some kind of point. "That's for people with national awards and perfect resumes," I said, "not people who clean dorm bathrooms on Saturdays." She put her glasses back on and looked at me like I had said something lazy. "Frances, don't confuse being unsupported with being unqualified." That sentence stayed with me. I did not suddenly become confident because that is not how it works. I still went back to my room that night and opened the Whitfield application like it might reach through the screen and reject me personally. But Dr. Smith started checking on me after class, then during office hours, then through emails that were short enough to scare me and helpful enough to keep me moving. She told me which classes to take, which professors to build relationships with, which campus research program to apply for. She did not mother me. She did not rescue me. She treated me like someone worth investing time in, and that almost hurt more than being ignored, because I had no idea what to do with it. That was also when Rebecca Miller became more than the girl in the room across the hall who always had snacks. She was loud, funny, practical, and nosy in a way that somehow did not feel invasive. She caught me crying in the laundry room once because I had dropped a wet load of clothes on the floor after a double shift, and instead of asking dramatic questions, she handed me quarters and said, "We're rewashing them, and then you're eating something with protein." After that, she started leaving granola bars on my desk and texting me when I forgot meals. I kept telling her I was fine. She kept saying, "No, you're functional." That's different. Sophomore year turned into a blur of work, grades, and trying not to think about home. Victoria posted photos from campus formals, ski weekends, spring break trips, brunches with girls who looked like they had never checked a bank balance before ordering coffee. I saw them because I had not unfollowed her yet, which was my own fault. Every few months, Mom would call and ask if I was doing okay, but she never asked the kind of question that would force her to hear the real answer. Dad barely called at all. When he did, it was usually because Mom put him on speaker for 30 seconds so he could say, "Keep working hard," like he was signing a yearbook. By junior year, I had a 4.0 GPA, 2 campus awards, a research assistant position, and a body that felt 10 years older than it was. Once, I nearly passed out during my morning shift at the cafe, and my manager made me sit in the back with orange juice until my hands stopped shaking. I remember being embarrassed more than scared. I kept thinking, if I fall apart, they win. That was not healthy, and I know that now, but at the time, it was the thing holding me together. Dr. Smith noticed anyway. She called me into her office that afternoon, closed the door, and said, "You can be determined without treating yourself like an enemy." I wanted to argue, but I was too tired. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a printed copy of the Whitfield scholarship requirements, with notes in her handwriting all over the margins. 10 essays, 3 interviews, recommendations, financial documentation, leadership records, academic work samples. It looked like a mountain disguised as paperwork. "I'm nominating you," she said. I stared at the folder and felt that old voice in my head again, Dad's voice, telling me there was no return on investment with me. Dr. Smith must have seen something on my face because she tapped the folder once and said, "Let's make sure the right people get to decide what you're worth." The application took 3 months, and I hated almost every minute of it. Not because the work was hard, though it was, but because every essay asked me to turn my life into proof. Resilience, leadership, obstacles, vision. Those words sounded clean on the page, but the truth behind them was ugly and boring and exhausting. It was instant noodles, unpaid family silence, cracked laptop keys, 4 hours of sleep, and smiling through questions about why my parents never visited. Rebecca read drafts on our kitchen floor with a red pen, eating cereal out of a mug. Dr. Smith tore apart my first personal statement so badly I had to sit outside her office for 10 minutes before I could walk back to class. Then, in September of senior year, the email came at 6:47 a.m. while I was tying my apron for the cafe shift. I had made the final round. 50 finalists, 20 winners. The interview was in New York, 800 miles away, on a Friday morning, and my bank account had $847 in it, with rent due in 2 weeks. For about 5 minutes, I just sat on my bed and stared at the screen, feeling the door open and close at the same time. Then Rebecca walked in without knocking, saw my face, grabbed the laptop, and screamed so loud one of our roommates banged on the wall. When I told her I couldn't afford to go, she said, "Bus ticket, overnight, I'll pay. Don't start with me." So I went. I rode 8 hours through the night in a stiff seat that smelled like old coffee, wearing a borrowed blazer from Rebecca and shoes I had polished with a paper towel. The waiting room at the Whitfield office was full of students with perfect hair, parents adjusting collars, leather portfolios, the kind of quiet confidence money teaches you early. I looked at my scuffed shoes and almost turned around. Then I thought about that Thanksgiving photo with 3 plates. I thought about Dad's camera always pointed at Victoria. I thought about Dr. Smith's folder, Rebecca's bus ticket, and the cracked laptop still sitting on my desk back at Eastbrook. I stayed in the chair until they called my name. The interview itself was not dramatic in the way I expected. Nobody tried to humiliate me. Nobody laughed at my thrift store blazer or asked where my parents were. That almost made me more nervous because I had prepared myself for judgment, not careful attention. There were 5 people at the table, and they asked about my research, my work schedule, my long-term plans, my leadership experience, and how I defined support. That last question almost got me. I remember looking down at my hands and saying, "Support is not always someone paying for you. Sometimes it's one person telling you that you're not crazy for trying." I thought of Dr. Smith when I said it. I thought of Rebecca, too, probably asleep back at Eastbrook after forcing me onto that bus with a sandwich wrapped in foil. 2 weeks later, I was walking to the morning grind before sunrise when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The subject line said, "Whitfield Scholarship Decision." I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk so suddenly a cyclist swerved around me and cursed, but I barely heard him. I opened the email with my thumb shaking so hard I clicked the wrong line twice. "Dear Ms. Townsend, we are pleased to inform you..." That was as far as I got before my knees just gave out a little. I sat down on the curb in my work shoes and cried in a way I hope never ends up on anyone's security camera. It was not pretty crying. It was 3 years of fear coming out all at once, the kind of crying where strangers slow down and then decide they do not want to get involved. The scholarship covered full tuition and gave me a living stipend. It also came with something I had not really paid attention to before because it seemed too unlikely to matter. Whitfield scholars at partner universities could transfer for their final year if the academic program made sense. Whitmore was on the partner list. I read that line 5 times in Dr. Smith's office while she sat across from me pretending she was not watching my face. Whitmore, where Victoria was. Whitmore, the school my father had called a smart investment when it belonged to her and an impossible dream when it could have belonged to me. Dr. Smith said their policy and economics track was stronger for what I wanted to do, and she was right. She also knew exactly what else it meant, because when I looked up from the page, she said, "Do not make this about them, but do not shrink from what they will see either." I did not tell my family. Maybe that sounds cold, but by then silence was the only thing in that family that still belonged to me. They had not asked how I paid for Eastbrook. They had not asked where I lived. They had not asked why I stopped coming home for holidays, or why my voice sounded tired on the rare calls Mom made from the car while running errands. So when the transfer went through, I packed my things, hugged Rebecca until she told me I was squeezing her ribs, and moved into a small off-campus room near Whitmore with 2 suitcases and a scholarship letter folded inside my planner. I walked onto that campus in September and felt the strangest mix of satisfaction and nausea. The brick walkways were exactly like Victoria's photos, polished and expensive and almost smug. For the first few weeks, I kept my head down and told myself I was there for the program. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. Victoria found me in the library in October. I was sitting in a 3rd-floor study carrel with a constitutional law textbook open in front of me, highlighting a paragraph I had already read 3 times, when I heard someone say my name like they had seen a ghost. I looked up, and there she was, holding an iced latte, her mouth slightly open, her hair perfect, her Whitmore sweatshirt probably costing more than my weekly groceries. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything useful. Then she said, "What are you doing here?" Not, "How are you?" Not, "I didn't know." Just that. "What are you doing here?" Like I had wandered into the wrong part of someone else's life. I closed my book and said, "I transferred." She blinked at me. "Since when?" I told her September, and I watched her trying to make that fit with everything she thought she knew about me. "Mom and Dad didn't say anything," she said. I said, "Mom and Dad don't know." Her face changed then. Confusion first, then embarrassment, then something sharper when she realized she had no idea what my life had been for years. She asked how I was paying for Whitmore, and I said, "Scholarship." The words sat there between us. I could almost see her remembering every time she had posted from a paid-for dorm room, every break trip, every dinner out, every moment she had assumed I was somewhere smaller because that was simply where I belonged. She asked why I had not told anyone, and I almost gave her a nicer answer. I almost said it was complicated. I almost let her keep some version of comfort because that had always been my job around her, smoothing the edges of things so she never had to feel how sharp they were. Instead, I looked at my own twin sister and asked, "Did you ever ask?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, Victoria did not have an easy response. I gathered my books, and when she reached for my sleeve, her voice came out smaller. "Do you hate us?" I looked at her hand on my arm and realized I did not feel the explosion I used to imagine. I just felt tired. "No," I said. "I don't hate you. I just stopped waiting for you." My phone started lighting up that night. Mom called first, then Dad, then Victoria again, then Mom twice more. I let every call go unanswered because I knew if I picked up too soon, they would make the conversation about shock instead of truth. Dad finally called the next morning while I was walking back from class, and for the first time in years, his name on my screen made me laugh under my breath. Not because it was funny, because he had found my number again the second he felt embarrassed. When I answered, he said, "Francis, we need to talk." I asked, "About what?" And he actually sounded offended when he said, "Victoria says you're at Whitmore. You transferred without telling us." I stopped near a bench outside the business building, watching students pass with backpacks and coffee cups, all of them living normal mornings, while my old life tried to drag me back by the ankle. Dad said they cared. Of course they cared. I was their daughter. I heard myself ask, "Am I?" And there was no anger in it, which made it worse. I reminded him of the living room, of the acceptance letter, of his exact words. He said he did not remember saying it. That was the moment I knew he was either lying or had said it so easily that it had not cost him anything. I told him I remembered enough for both of us. He went quiet, then said we could discuss it at graduation because they were coming for Victoria's ceremony. I looked across the campus at the banners already starting to appear for the senior events and said, "I'll see you there, Dad." Then I hung up before he could turn my life into another meeting he controlled. The 3 months before graduation were strange because everyone in my family knew a piece of the truth, but nobody knew the whole thing. Victoria knew I was at Whitmore, and from the way she avoided me on campus after that library conversation, I think she was scared of what else she might learn. Mom knew enough to leave voicemails that sounded careful and wounded, like she was trying to apologize without naming anything specific. Dad knew I had somehow gotten into the room he never thought would open for me, but he still did not know I had been named valedictorian. He did not know about the Whitfield medallion. He did not know the university had chosen me to speak. I kept waiting for someone to figure it out. Whitmore sent announcements. The honors office emailed schedules. My name appeared on a commencement program draft weeks before the ceremony, and every time I opened my inbox, I felt this sharp little jolt, like surely this would be the day someone called screaming. Nobody did. That told me something I didn't want to admit out loud. Even after finding out I was at Whitmore, my parents still had not looked closely enough to see what I was doing there. They knew I existed on the same campus as Victoria, and somehow they still managed to keep me blurry. Dr. Smith flew in the day before graduation, which felt almost impossible to me. She had no obligation to come. She had papers to grade, conferences to attend, probably 100 better uses of her time than watching a former student try not to fall apart in a cap and gown. But she arrived with one small suitcase, met me and Rebecca for dinner, and listened while Rebecca talked too fast because she was excited and nervous for me. At one point, Dr. Smith looked across the table and asked, "Have you decided what you're going to say?" I told her I had written 3 versions and hated all of them. She nodded like that was normal and said, "Then stop writing for the people who hurt you. Speak to the people who need to hear you survived it." The night before graduation, Rebecca helped me steam my dress in the tiny bathroom of my apartment. It was navy blue, simple, new, and more expensive than anything I had bought in years, even though it came from the sale rack. She kept saying I looked powerful, and I kept telling her I felt like I was going to throw up. We laughed too hard at that because both of us were tired and scared. And then I sat on the edge of my bed after she left and stared at the speech printed on my desk. I had not named my parents. I had not named Victoria. But the truth was there, plain enough that the people who needed to recognize themselves would. Graduation morning was too bright. That is the dumb detail I remember most. The sun bouncing off the stadium seats, the white programs flashing in people's hands, the gold cords and flowers and balloons making everything look almost cheerful in a way that felt rude. I entered through the faculty side because speakers had to line up early, and for a few minutes I was hidden behind the stage with professors, administrators, and a few other honors students adjusting their gowns. Someone clipped the Whitfield medallion properly against my chest because my hands were shaking too much to do it straight. The gold valedictorian sash sat across my shoulders, heavy in a way fabric should not be heavy. When I finally stepped into the front seating area, I saw them almost immediately. My parents were in the first row, dead center, exactly where Dad would want to be for Victoria's big day. He wore his navy suit and had his camera already in his lap. Mom held a bouquet of roses wrapped in pale paper, the kind she used to say was too expensive for ordinary occasions. Between them was an empty chair, with Mom's purse resting on it. I looked at that chair longer than I should have. Even at my own graduation, before they knew it was mine too, the empty space beside them was being used to hold things, not me. Victoria was seated with the other graduates, laughing with two friends and checking her phone. She had not seen me yet, or maybe she had and decided not to react. I watched Dad lift his camera and aim it toward her section, adjusting the lens with the focused expression he used for things he considered important. For a second, an ugly little feeling rose in me. Not revenge exactly, more like grief with teeth. I had spent years wanting him to point that camera at me, and now, in a few minutes, he would have no choice. I hated that it still mattered. I hated that I cared even then. The ceremony started with the usual speeches, welcome remarks, jokes about late nights and student loans, applause that came in polite waves. I barely heard most of it. My hands were folded in my lap so tightly my fingers started to ache. And Rebecca was somewhere in the crowd with Dr. Smith, probably watching me like I might bolt. Then the university president returned to the podium and introduced the valedictorian and Whitfield scholar. He talked about resilience, academic excellence, unusual determination, and I saw Mom lean toward Dad with a polite smile, probably wondering whose child he was describing. Dad lifted the camera again, still angled toward Victoria. Then the president said my name. Please join me in welcoming Frances Townsend. For 1 second, nothing moved. I stood up, and the applause started before my parents understood what they were seeing. I walked toward the podium with the sash across my shoulders and the medallion catching the sun, and I watched their faces change in stages. Dad's camera froze halfway up. Mom's bouquet slid crooked in her lap. Victoria turned so fast her tassel swung across her face. By the time I reached the microphone, my parents were staring at me like I had stepped out of a locked room they forgot they built. I looked down at the speech, then out at 3,000 people, and somehow my voice came out steady. I said, "Good morning." I thanked the faculty, the families, the friends who had carried people through years they could not have carried alone. Then I paused because the next sentence was the one I had almost deleted 10 times. 4 years ago, I said, I was told I was not worth the investment. The stadium got quiet in a way I could feel against my skin. In the front row, my mother's hand went to her mouth. Dad lowered the camera completely, and for once, he had nothing in his hands that could help him manage what was happening. I did not tell the crowd my parents had said it. I did not have to. I spoke about working mornings before class, cleaning buildings on weekends, borrowing books, riding an overnight bus to an interview I almost skipped because I could not afford to believe in it. I spoke about the people who saw me when I had almost stopped expecting to be seen. I looked once toward Dr. Smith and Rebecca was already crying, wiping her face with both hands like she was mad about it. When I said that being unsupported is not the same as being unqualified, I saw Dr. Smith's face soften just slightly. That line was hers as much as mine. By the end, people were standing. Not everyone at once, but enough that the sound rose and spread until the whole stadium felt like it was moving. I stepped back from the podium, and only then did my knees start shaking. My parents were still seated. Mom was crying openly now, and Dad looked smaller than I had ever seen him, like the version of himself he trusted had cracked in public. I walked down from the stage into applause, past faculty and photographers and hands reaching out to congratulate me, and I knew the next part was coming. because my parents were already standing, pushing toward the aisle, trying to reach me now that everyone else had seen me first. My parents reached me near the reception tent after 3 separate people had already stopped me to shake my hand. That mattered, even though I did not want it to matter. They had spent years making me feel like I was something to explain away, and now they had to wait while strangers treated me like someone worth congratulating. Dad got to me first, still holding his camera by the strap, but it was hanging at his side now instead of aimed at Victoria. His face had that tight, stunned look people get when they are trying to recover their authority and cannot find it. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. And that was the first thing out of his mouth. Not congratulations, not I'm proud of you, not even I'm sorry. I looked at him, then at Mom standing beside him with mascara under her eyes and the rose bouquet pressed against her stomach like she needed something to hold. I said, "Did you ever ask?" Dad opened his mouth, but nothing came out right away. Mom whispered my name like she was scared of it. I had imagined that moment so many times, and in every version I was sharper, louder, maybe even cruel. But standing there, with the medallion still warm from the sun, I mostly felt tired. Mom started apologizing in pieces. She said they did not know, they had no idea, they would have helped if they had understood. That one almost made me laugh, but I didn't. I said, "You understood enough when you paid for Victoria." Dad's jaw moved like he was chewing on an argument he could not say out loud in front of people. I reminded him of the living room, the acceptance letter, the words he claimed not to remember. "You told me there was no return on investment with me," I said. "Then you spent the next 4 years proving you meant it." That landed harder than I expected. Dad looked down, and for once, he did not correct my tone. Then James Whitfield III walked up and shook my hand. He congratulated me on the speech, said the foundation was lucky to have my name attached to it, and asked if I would be willing to speak at a donor event later that summer. He was polite, polished, completely unaware of the storm he had just stepped into. My parents watched him talk to me like I was valuable, and I saw the exact moment they understood how bad it looked. Not just emotionally bad, publicly bad, socially bad. The daughter they had dismissed was now being praised by the kind of man my father would have tried to impress at a dinner table. It got worse for them after that, not because I chased it, but because truth travels differently when people can see it. Mrs. Patterson from my parents' country club came over with a bright smile and said, "Diane, you must be beside yourself. A Whitfield scholar and valedictorian? How did you keep that quiet?" Mom's smile shook so badly I almost felt sorry for her. Dad tried to step in and say something about me being private, but Mrs. Patterson kept going, asking whether they had known about my speech, whether they helped me prepare, whether both their daughters had always been so accomplished. It was the first time I watched my parents trapped by the family image they had spent years protecting. They could not brag without lying, and they could not tell the truth without exposing themselves. Victoria came over later, after the crowd thinned. She looked younger than usual, or maybe just less polished. She said congratulations, and I said thank you. For a second we stood there like strangers who happened to have the same face in old birthday photos. Then she said, "I should have asked how you were doing." I wanted to tell her yes, she should have. I wanted to tell her that being unaware was easier when everything was handed to you. Instead, I said, "Yeah, you should have." She nodded and started crying, but she did not ask me to comfort her, and I respected that more than any big apology she could have made. I did not go to the family dinner they had planned for Victoria that night. Mom asked, then Dad asked, then Mom asked again in a softer voice, as if softness had ever fixed anything. I told them I already had plans with Rebecca and Dr. Smith. Dad said, "So that's it? You're cutting us off?" I said, "No, I'm setting the door where I can reach it." It was clumsy, and I almost hated how it sounded, but it was true. I told them they could call me if they were ready to talk honestly, not if they wanted me to make them feel better. Then I walked away before they could turn my boundary into a family debate. The fallout kept going after graduation. Dad's business friends saw clips of the speech online and asked him about me. Mom wrote me a 3-page letter in her looping handwriting, admitting she had hidden behind Dad's decisions because it was easier than protecting me. Victoria called 3 days later and asked if we could get coffee when I was ready. I did not forgive everybody at once. I did not suddenly feel healed because people finally felt bad. But the old arrangement was broken, and that mattered. They could not put me back in the corner of the photo after the whole room had watched me stand at the podium. 2 months later, I moved into a tiny studio apartment in New York with one window, a terrible kitchen, and rent that made my stomach hurt. It was still mine. I started my job, worked too many hours, bought my own groceries, and put Mom's letter in a drawer until I was ready to answer it. 6 months after graduation, Dad called and finally said the sentence I had stopped expecting. I failed you. He did not dress it up. He did not blame stress or money or my attitude. I told him I hurt him, and that was all I could give him that day. It was not forgiveness, but it was something cleaner than pretending. I still think about that front row chair sometimes. The empty one with Mom's purse sitting on it, while they waited to celebrate the daughter they had chosen out loud. For years, I thought I needed them to make space for me. Now I understand that I can choose where I sit, who gets access to me, and what kind of love I am willing to accept. I was not a bad investment. I was just never supposed to be measured by people who only understood worth when it made them look good. If this story meant something to you, please like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel, and it helps more people find stories about being overlooked, underestimated, and finally choosing yourself. Have you ever had someone in your family treat you like the less important one? Would you have told the parents before graduation, or let them find out in the crowd? And do you think Frances should rebuild the relationship slowly, or keep more distance?